King Kong ain't got nothing on me. One line, delivered by a man in a bathtub, surrounded by people who want him dead, with nothing left to lose. And with it, Densel Washington turned a corrupt cop into one of the most terrifying villains in American cinema history, and won an Oscar doing it. Today, 15 facts about Training Day, from the actor who turned down the role that made Densel Washington a legend, to the real gang members who appeared on screen, to the detail that made the LAPD furious when the film came out. Stick around for the bonus. It involves a real dirty cop, a federal investigation, and the reason the script felt less like fiction and more like a document. Fact 1. The role every major actor in Hollywood didn't want. Before Densel Washington became Detective Alonzo Harris, the role had been declined by a significant number of Hollywood's most established male stars. The problem was consistent. Actors didn't want to play a villain this complete. Alonzo Harris had no redemptive arc, no moment of conscience, no third-act reversal. He was the antagonist from the first scene to the last. Washington read the script and saw something different. A man who believed every word he said, a predator with a philosophy, not a cartoon. He took the role. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. It remains the only Oscar win of his career for playing a villain, and the performance most people cite when they describe what he is capable of. Fact 2. Ethan Hawke was told he had no chance, and was nominated anyway. Hawke was cast as Jake Hoyt after a casting process that prioritized finding someone who could hold the screen against Washington without disappearing into his shadow. When he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, the industry consensus was that it was a courtesy nomination. Nobody who had spent the film being systematically outplayed by Densel Washington could win. Hawke didn't win, but the nomination represented something real. In a movie built around one overwhelming performance, the person being overwhelmed had given a performance specific and convincing enough to earn independent recognition. That's considerably harder than it looks. Fact 3. David Ayer wrote it from his own life. Hollywood spent years not believing him. David Ayer wrote Training Day based on his own experiences growing up in South Central Los Angeles and his research into LAPD culture. The script was personal, specific, and deliberately uncomfortable in its portrait of institutional corruption. It sat in development for years. Studios were interested but consistently uncertain about whether a story in which the corrupt cop is the most compelling person on screen could find a mainstream audience. What got it made was Antoine Fuqua's attachment and, eventually, Washington's. Two names that could sell tickets changed the calculation overnight. Fact 4, released 3 weeks after 9/11, about corrupt cops. Nobody was ready for it. Training Day was released in October 2001, less than a month after September 11th. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, depicting law enforcement as systematically corrupt was politically complicated in ways it might not have been a year earlier or later. The LAPD had not been consulted during production. The department made clear it considered the film damaging to its public image, not because of specific inaccuracies, but because of the portrait of a culture in which Alonzo Harris was not an aberration, but a product. The Rampart scandal, in which dozens of LAPD officers were implicated in evidence planting and drug theft, had broken in 1999. The film arrived 2 years later. The timing was not lost on anyone. Fact 5. The real gang members on screen were the real gang members. Several of the gang members who appear in Training Day were played by actual gang members from the neighborhoods where the film was shot. This was not a casting decision made for authenticity. It was a practical necessity. Fuqua's team had determined early that filming in certain neighborhoods required the cooperation of the people who controlled those neighborhoods. The men who appear in several of the film's most tense sequences were not acting in any conventional sense. They were present the way they were always present. The cameras were pointed at them. The tension in those scenes is real because the situation producing it was real. Fact 6. Densel Washington didn't prepare for the role. He lived it first. Washington's preparation was extensive and specific. He spent several months before production began embedding himself in the South Central neighborhoods where the film was set, riding with narcotics officers and studying the behavioral language of men who operated in the space between law enforcement and criminality. The specificity of his performance, the way Alonzo moves, the cadence of his speech, the particular quality of his charm, came from observation rather than invention. By the time cameras rolled, Washington knew Alonzo Harris well enough to improvise within him. Several of the film's most memorable lines were developed during production rather than taken directly from the script. Fact 7. King Kong Ain't Got Nothing on Me was partly improvised. The bathtub speech, Alonzo's final monologue as the neighborhood turns against him, is the scene most cited when people describe Washington's performance. The core existed on the page, the specific energy, the escalating quality of a man who has spent the entire film in control finally losing it, that emerged during filming. King Kong Ain't Got Nothing on Me was not in David Ayer's original screenplay. It was Washington's. The line that became the film's most quoted moment came from the actor rather than the writer. A detail that says something about the relationship between a great script and a great performance. Fact 8. How do you film in neighborhoods that don't want cameras? Training Day was shot almost entirely on location in South Central Los Angeles, Watts, and Crenshaw. For a major studio production, this was unusual. Film crews typically prefer controlled environments that can be made to resemble the real thing. Fuqua insisted on the real thing. The visual texture of the film, the quality of light, the density of the environment, the way the neighborhood feels inhabited rather than dressed, comes directly from the decision to be there. Several scenes required the cooperation of people who had no obligation to cooperate and chose to anyway. The film exists in its current form because of those relationships. A role every major star in Hollywood declined, a script that spent years being admired and shelved, and real gang members on screen because the production needed their permission to be there at all. We're not halfway through. Still coming, the real dirty cop whose case inspired the script, the Oscar that broke a 39-year drought, and the bonus, a federal investigation, a convicted officer, and the moment fiction and reality became impossible to separate. Fact 9. The studios called it too dark to believe. A federal investigation confirmed every detail. Ayer has been consistently direct about the real-world sources of the screenplay. The character of Alonzo Harris was drawn from composite research into LAPD narcotics culture, informed by the Rampart scandal and the officers implicated in it. Rafael Perez, the LAPD officer whose cooperation with prosecutors broke the scandal open, provided accounts of conduct that closely mirrored what Alonzo Harris does on screen. Officers stealing drugs from dealers, planting evidence on suspects, operating with the confidence of men who believed the system would protect them. Alonzo Harris was not a character Ayer invented. He was a character Ayer assembled from testimony. Fact 10. The studio wanted a different ending, and Fuqua refused. Studio notes pushed for a more conventional conclusion. Audiences needed to feel the good guy had won decisively, that the corruption had been meaningfully punished, that order had been restored. Fuqua declined. The film ends with Hoyt alive and Alonzo dead, but with everything that made Alonzo possible still in place. The corruption isn't defeated. One corrupt man is removed from it. The distinction was, for Fuqua, the entire point of the film. Fact 11. Sidney Poitier won in 1964. The next Black Best Actor winner had to wait until 2002. When Washington won Best Actor at the 2002 ceremony, he became only the second Black actor to win in that category, following Sidney Poitier, who had won in 1964. The gap between those two wins was 38 years. At the same ceremony, Halle Berry won Best Actress for Monsters Ball, the first time in Oscar history that both acting awards went to black performers in the same year. Washington's win was for playing a villain. The role Hollywood had considered too dark and too risky produced the defining award of one of the most decorated careers in American cinema. The risk was the reason. Fact 12. The film's color palette was a deliberate psychological choice. Cinematographer Mauro Fiore and Fuqua decided the film would become progressively darker as the day went on. The early sequences are shot with a warmth that slowly drains. By the final act, the visual environment has become genuinely threatening. The neighborhoods that opened the film as merely unfamiliar have become labyrinthine. The visual progression mirrors Jake Hoyt's psychological journey. A man who began the day believing he understood the world he was entering ends it, understanding that he never did. Most viewers felt it without ever consciously registering it. Fact 13. Scott Glenn was cast and then replaced before filming began. Scott Glenn was originally attached to play Alonzo Harris. When Fuqua came aboard as director, he had a different vision for the character and a specific actor in mind. Washington's casting required Glenn's departure from a role he had been preparing for. The fact that a casting decision of that magnitude was reversed after a director change, and that the reversal produced one of the most celebrated performances of the decade, illustrates how completely a single creative hire can alter the trajectory of a film. Fact 14. One day. Shot in order. so the exhaustion on screen would be real. Fuqua filmed largely in chronological order rather than grouping scenes by location as standard practice requires. The reason, the film's emotional arc depended on accumulation. Ethan Hawke's Jake Hoyt needed to have actually lived through the earlier scenes before filming the later ones. The exhaustion, the confusion, the progressive undermining of his certainties needed to be real rather than performed. It cost the production in scheduling efficiency. It bought a performance that develops the way a person develops across a day, carrying everything that came before into every moment that follows. Fact 15. Hollywood said audiences needed resolution. Training Day proved them wrong. At the box office. Before Training Day, the template for the Hollywood corrupt cop thriller was essentially fixed. The system might be flawed, but the individual hero corrected the flaw. The ending restored order. Training Day refused every element of that template. The corruption is structural. The hero's survival is luck rather than virtue. The ending restores nothing. The film earned $76 million against a $45 million budget and generated awards attention across the industry, demonstrating that audiences would engage with discomfort rather than resolution. The crime films that followed operated in a landscape Training Day had permanently altered. The template didn't disappear, but a different template became possible. And now the bonus I've been saving for last. A federal investigation, a convicted officer, and the moment everyone stopped calling Training Day fiction. When the Rampart scandal broke in 1999, Rafael Perez provided investigators with accounts of LAPD conduct almost identical to what Ayer had been writing in his screenplay. Officers stealing drugs, evidence planted on innocent suspects, a system of internal silence that protected its own. Ayer had not had access to Perez's testimony. The screenplay predated the scandal's public emergence. When Training Day was released 2 years later, the question of whether the film depicted reality or fiction had already been answered, not by the filmmakers, but by a federal investigation that had arrived at the same portrait through a different route. The film studios had spent years worrying was too dark and too cynical. It turned out to be, by the standards of documented fact, considerably more restrained than the truth.